whole different column, Justin.
Exactly. But D.C. is much, much, much worse off than New York. I mean, the overall jobs are down 4.5% instead of about 1%, like in New York City. And it's just, across every single job category, except information, which is like the media in D.C. and some internet stuff. Everything but that is down, which in New York, a bunch of job categories are up. It's kind of funny because in D.C., government employment is down less than in other places. But you're right, government workers are just not coming back. In New York, you've had definitely in the finance sector a lot of pressure to bring people back. And I think in federal government has just been stuck on that. And so that's interesting. Government employment is down more everywhere else in the country, mostly local government. But in D.C., it's not down much, but those people aren't coming in, and that's having a huge effect on the city.
So converting those downtown offices into apartments, as you alluded to in your column in Manhattan, specifically Wall Street, actually, how would that lure people back if they won't come downtown to work? Are they going to come downtown to live?
Well, in Wall Street, that's happened. You could say at this point it's more of a residential neighborhood than an office neighborhood. It still feels like an office neighborhood because it's got these narrow streets and very tall buildings, but there are more than 60,000 people living down in the financial district where I think in 1970 there were 800. And that's something, there were a couple of the Battery Park City was this big new development built on sort of the land, the dirt they dug up for the World Trade Center. That was part of it. But since the 90s, well, in the 90s, there was this really concerted effort by the city because there was a ton of vacant office space down there to convert, especially older buildings, into apartments, and it happened. And what's kind of interesting is it's this like really fancy neighborhood now, even though it's all these people who don't need to commute to work, but have basically the best transit in the country, and they increasingly have restaurants and other things to go to as well.
Who are the big losers? Is there any sector that can benefit, and which sectors are struggling?
Well, among sort of service sectors where there's a lot of jobs that you don't need a college degree for, leisure and hospitality, and it's still down nationally too. Restaurants are almost back, but accommodation, hotels, and sort of entertainment is still down from where it was before. And then this grab bag category called other services, which is like dry cleaners, manicurists, all of that is also down. And so, one interesting thing, in most places, another category that is up that has some very high-end jobs, but also a lot of not so high-end jobs, is healthcare. It's up in most places. Again, in D.C. it's down, but in most places that's up. But in New York it's up a lot. And at one level it feels a little unsustainable how fast healthcare employment has grown. It's like the biggest part of it is home healthcare services. But on the other hand, at least given all the other service jobs that have been lost in New York City, it's been kind of a welcome replacement. And you get the sense that some people have shifted from sort of hospitality jobs to those jobs.
Let's talk about that shift. Is the workforce completely different now? Has the pandemic fundamentally changed the way most of us work?
No, a lot of those jobs are exactly the same as they were before. That's sort of the thing.
But it has impacted them.
There are a lot fewer leisure and hospitality jobs, and it's interesting at this point how much of that is because I think spending on restaurants is significantly higher in real inflation-adjusted terms now than it was before the pandemic. There are just a lot fewer workers, and I think part of it is just a lot of people, when they lost their jobs and that, were sort of like, I think I'm going to do something else now, and have shifted to other fields. It's funny, in New York City, so much of the attention, understandably, has been about high-end office workers and will they keep coming to the city and will they stay, and that's still an issue, and how often people will come in is an issue, and whether enough of them will use public transit to pay the bills is an issue. But in terms of who's been leaving New York City, it's not it's people in the Bronx. The Bronx is now is the main borough with losing population, and that's the poorest borough. It's the working class borough, and I think people there are just like, I'm not finding jobs that can pay my rent, so I'm going to move to North Carolina or Florida or wherever.
So where is this going? Will the pendulum swing back?
I mean, New York's gonna be different. It's an interesting, like, New York created a crazy amount of jobs in the last decade, but it feels like those jobs to serve those people, there just aren't going to be as many of those. And so it's just an interesting question what it means for New York, for its school system, which has a lot fewer students, which again, the biggest losses in the Bronx, because so many people have been leaving to go find better work somewhere else. It's just weird. It's very different from the population loss the city had in the 60s and 70s, but it's a lot of population loss, and it's just going to be interesting to see where this goes.
Yeah, we're going to watch it with you, Justin. Thank you so much for taking the time with us.
Thanks for having me.
Justin Fox is a Bloomberg opinion columnist. Don't forget, we're available as a podcast on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Now stay with us. Coming up, we'll pull back the curtain and take a peek at what's going on behind the scenes of the coronavirus pandemic. This is Bloomberg Opinion.
Proceed about 1 mile to Cedar Swamp Road.
Missed your favorite Bloomberg radio show? Bloomberg Business Week, Masters in Business, Bloomberg Intelligence, and more are also available as podcasts. Listen today on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This is a Bloomberg Money Minute. Tax day is just a week away. And this year, the IRS says federal tax returns will be smaller, an average of 11% smaller than a year ago. So what's behind the decline? Eric Bronenkamp, head of tax at the financial services firm Betterment, says the big reason, some pandemic-era stimulus measures that have expired.
Most of those were temporary, and some of the biggest ones were like the expanded child tax credit, which increased the child tax credit from like $2,000 to $3,600. There was also an expanded dependent care tax credit.
And with inflation still rising and a lot of economic uncertainty, the end of those credits affects the people who need them most, low and moderate income Americans. So what can taxpayers do now? Bronenkamp says
there are going to be greater constraints, and that those tax benefits aren't here, and that they're going to have to work harder to fit their costs into their budget.
Tom Busby, Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm Susanna Palmer in the Bloomberg Newsroom. When U.S. banks start to report fiscal first quarter results this week, what their executives say about deposit levels and liquidity is going to be of greater interest to investors than any full-year profit guidance. Nerves do remain frayed following the crisis of confidence in regional banks sparked off by last month's collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. According to Bloomberg estimates, J.P. Morgan, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo, all reporting on Friday, could have seen deposits shrink sequentially by a total of about $63 billion for the quarter, a decline of 1.4% on average. The International Monetary Fund warned that its outlook for global economic growth over the next 5 years is the weakest in more than 3 decades, urging nations to avoid economic fragmentation caused by geopolitical tension and take steps to boost productivity. The emergency lender sees the world economy expanding about 3% over the next half-decade as higher interest rates take a bite. Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva spoke about the outlook.
Countries that we would expect to add to growth, frontier markets, low-income countries, are in particularly difficult place because they have been innocent bystanders of repetitive shocks. COVID, Russia's invasion, the fact that the world economy as a whole is now less able to support the weakest members.
Georgieva there speaking with Bloomberg's Tom Keene. U.S. credit conditions for consumers and businesses are expected to deteriorate in the next 6 months to their worst level since the pandemic. More from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
That's according to a survey of chief economists at 15 of the nation's biggest banks. The American Bankers Association says its credit conditions index fell to 5.8 in the second quarter from 12.5 in the first quarter. A reading below 50 in the gauge, which is derived from answers to the survey, indicates that the economists forecast weaker credit conditions in the coming 6 months. Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
Amazon.com's Whole Foods Market is exploring building and buying off-site kitchens to make prepared meals for its stores. That, according to the Wall Street Journal. The report says the move would help the company to better control the quality of its prepared foods, citing people familiar with the matter. It would also reverse Amazon's 2017 decision to close its kitchens in order to cut costs. Jeff Turness, Senior Vice President of Global Culinary at Whole Foods, told the Wall Street Journal the company is constantly evaluating ways to produce food, including operating its own facilities, working with third parties, and using in-store kitchens. Global News 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Susanna Palmer. This is Bloomberg.
Nearly 1 in 2 U.S. adults have high blood pressure. That's why it's important to self-monitor your blood pressure in 4 easy-to-remember steps. It starts with a monitor. Be next to talk to your doctor about your blood pressure numbers. Get down with your blood pressure. Self-monitoring is power. Visit managerbp.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council, the American Heart Association, and the American Medical Association, in partnership with the Office of Minority Health and Health Resources and Services Administration.
Wherever your business takes you, Bloomberg Radio is here with you.
Breaking economic news crossing the Bloomberg.
Powered by 2,700 journalists and analysts.